I would like to try some recently discovered Welsh folk tales on my readership. Welsh tales seem to go down very well, and this is one that I'd not come across until recently. Hopefully it'll be followed by others if it proves a success. This story is called The Fairies' Revenge. There was once a farmer of Pantanus in Glamorgan, and some of the fields on his land were favourite haunts of the fairies. They often went there to dance in the green grass, to sing and make music, and of course they couldn't do any of these things without making a great deal of noise. The farmer must have been a very bad-tempered man, because he began to hate the fairies and considered them such a nuisance that he visited an old witch in the district to ask her advice about them. "These wretched fairies are a great trial to me," he told the old woman, "and I should like to know how I can get rid of them." "Well, well," grunted the old witch, "and what'll you give me if I tell you, eh? Can I have an evening's milk from your farm?" The farmer agreed to this. It was common practice in that county, to give the whole of one milking to men taken on as extra labour at harvest time, and the witch's request was not an unusual one. "To rid yourself of the fairies, all you have to do is plough up the fields where they meet," advised the old woman. "Fairies like the green grass, and when they find it gone, they will be annoyed and never return to bother you again." Pleased with the advice he'd received, the farmer of Pantanus returned to his farm and did as he'd been told. After the fields had been ploughed, no fairy was heard or seen in them, and complete silence reigned where once there had been heard music and chattering and laughter that had so annoyed the farmer. He sowed the land with wheat, and in the spring the fields were thick with young green shoots. One evening, when the farmer was returning home from his fields, he saw on the path in front of him a tiny man, dressed in green breeches and a scarlet coat. The little man approached the farmer, and boldly drawing a tiny sword, he pointed at him, saying in a high-pitched, squeaky voice, "Vengeance comes, and it approaches fast." The farmer began to laugh at what he thought was a silly little man, pretending to be very bold. But he didn't laugh for long. Something about the stern looks of the little fellow frightened him. However, he said nothing, and walked quickly on his way. A few nights later, as the farmer and his family were preparing for bed, they were alarmed by a loud noise. Following the noise, they heard a voice cry out, "Vengeance comes!" Nothing more happened until a few months later, when the golden corn in the fairy fields was reaped and stacked, and ready to be carried into the barn next day. But that night all the wonderful harvest was burnt in the fields, and no ear or straw of it was left. This was obviously the work of the fairies, and the farmer was filled with regret that he'd behaved so badly towards them. Better to suffer the noise of the little folk on his land than have them vent hatred and vengeance on him. As he gazed sorrowfully at his ruined crop, he noticed that the little red-coated chap was once again standing on the path in front of him, pointing his sword towards him as before and saying, "Vengeance but begins!" The farmer's ruddy face turned white as marble, and he called out after the retreating figure of the fairy, Please come back and help me, and listen to me, little man." At first the fairy refused, but again the farmer implored him, and the little chap turned round, looking sulkily up at him, and demanded, "Well, what do you want?" "I'm sorry for what happened," said the farmer, "and I'm quite willing to let the fields grow grass again. As you fairy folk like them so much, will you be very welcome there as often as you wish to come, but please, please, do me no more harm." "Our king has decreed that he will have revenge on you," was the reply, "and nothing can alter that." The farmer began to weep, and the tears rolled down his cheeks and onto the fairy until he was in some danger of drowning in them. Perhaps it was this that made the fairy relent a little. At any rate, he now said, "I'll speak to my lord about the matter. Meet me here at sunset in 3 days' time, and I'll let you know what he says." The farmer promised to do so, and a little comforted, went on his way. The time came for him to keep his appointment, and there, in exactly the same place, he found the fairy and listened eagerly to what he'd said. "I spoke to my lord, who has seriously considered your offer. He cannot alter his first decree." The farmer's face crumpled when he heard this, but brightened at the fairy's next words. "However, as you promised to return the fields to grass, He said that the fairy vengeance shall not fall on you or your children." This calmed the farmer, who immediately went off to make some arrangements for the ploughed fields to be returned to grass. So the fairies returned, and once more their sweet music and singing could be heard at night. But their noise no longer disturbed the farmer. Indeed, he was happy and relieved to hear it. 100 years went by, and the farmer's descendants lived peacefully on the Pantanus farm. True, every now and again a voice would be heard in the house crying, "Vengeance will come!" But this had not been happening for some time, so that no one took very much notice of it. One Christmas time, Reid, son of the present farmer of Pantanus, invited to supper Gwerfyl, his bride-to-be, a girl from a nearby farm. The family and the girl were sitting round the fire, warm and content after a field of roast goose, when they were suddenly frightened by the piercing shriek of a voice that seemed to come from somewhere outside the house. "The time for revenge has come!" screamed this terrifying voice. The company rose quickly and went outside. There, on a cold, clear night, they huddled together and listened in silence and fear. For a moment they heard nothing but the turbulent bubbling of the water from the nearby river Taff. Then from a pool in the river that was called the Black Cauldron, the dread voice rose again. "The time has come!" it cried. No one present knew what this meant, and they returned to the house and sat down again round the fire. No sooner were they settled than a little woman appeared, seemingly from nowhere, and stood on a table near the window. One of those present, his nerves no doubt shattered by what had just happened, said, "And what do you want here, you ugly little thing?" "Quiet, chatterer," replied the little woman. "I've come to tell you what's going to happen to one of this family, and now I shall not waste my time on you." And she disappeared. Whereupon the voice from the pool, which had been silent during the little woman's visit, began again. "The time has come! The time is come! The time of vengeance is come!" And on it went until all the farm was shaking with terror. "Come, Gwerfyl," said Reid. "This has been an unhappy evening for you. I will take you home." And together the lovers went off towards Penchraig Daff, where Gwerfyl lived. There Reid kissed her and said good night, and set off on the return journey to Pantanus. But alas, he never arrived. Days, weeks and months went by, and Reid's parents were beside themselves with grief. What had happened to their beloved son? Where was he? And when would he return? At last, in desperation, they visited a wise old man who lived in a cave in the hills. "What can have happened to our son?" they asked. "We've searched everywhere for him and cannot find him." The wise man couldn't help them. He listened while they told of the strange things that had happened on the night of Reid's disappearance, and then, shaking his head, he said to them, "I can offer you no comfort. From what I have heard, the disappearance of your son is the direct result of the curse the fairies laid on Pantanus many years ago. You will never see Reid again. He's been kidnapped by the fairy folk, and although he may appear generations later, he will not do so in your lifetime." If his parents accepted this fact, Reid's sweetheart did not. Gwerfyl waited hopefully for his return, and remained faithful to his memory. Every morning at dawn she went to the top of the small hill, and her eyes full of longing gazed in every direction to see if there was any sign of her lover returning. At noon she would go to the top of the hill again, and at sunset too. The years went by. Her youthful beauty faded. Still Gwerfyl made her pilgrimage. Everyone else had forgotten Reid but Gwerfyl. And at last, old and blind, death put an end to her hope. She was buried not far from Pantanus, in the chapel of the Fan. Like smoke, the years passed away, and like the shadows of the morning, the generations came and went until there was no longer anyone alive who remembered Reid. Although the story of his disappearance was often discussed, and it was said that no fairies had been seen and no fairy music heard since that terrible day so long ago. Now, to return to that day and to Reid. A few minutes after he'd said good night to Gwerfyl, he had been lured away by the fairies. In fact, they'd taken him to a cave where their king lived, and there, as he thought, he spent only a few days, and quite pleasant days they were. However, he was anxious to return home and to see his sweetheart, and this request, when made to the king of the fairies, was readily granted. It was a beautiful day when Rhydderch stepped out from the cave and made his way toward Pantanus. With a mixture of fear and wonder, he noticed on the way, where once had stood the chapel of the Fan, was now nothing but ruins. Where, he asked himself, had he been these last few days, that everything on his return should seem so strange? And indeed, how long had he been away? Had it really been only a few days? He turned his steps towards Pen Craig Daff, the home of Gwerfyl. But no one knew of whom he was talking. The name of Gwerfyl meant nothing to them. Noting Rhydderch's strange appearance and his wild manner, the present occupants of the house took him for a madman. He hastened them to Pantanus. He easily recognized his father's fields and the farmhouse, but the men working in the fields were strangers to him, as were those who were busy in the farmyard. They bade him good day, politely enough, but no one seemed to recognize him as the son of the house. The door of the farmhouse was opened by a young girl he had never seen before, and inside the house was much altered. Rhydderch demanded to see the farmer, and when he arrived from the fields was faced not by his own father, but by another complete stranger. "What can I do for you?" said the farmer. Haltingly, Rhydderch told him who he was, and begged for an explanation as to why everything was so changed in Pantanus. "You say your name is Rhydderch?" repeated the farmer in amazement. "Well, now surely it's not possible. I do remember my grandfather telling me how a youth of that name disappeared from this farm, in strange circumstances, hundreds of years ago." The farmer moved nearer to Rhydderch, as if to examine him more closely, for what he suspected seemed scarcely possible. As he did so, he accidentally knocked him with a walking stick as he had in his hand. Instantly, poor Rhydderch, so many hundreds of years old, crumbled into a mere handful of dust. Nothing more was ever seen or heard of him, and thus the revenge of the fairies was complete.